can see Wadi Watir there in the distance. Yeah, Wadi Watir just kind of pops up like a big V. So they could have landed anywhere here now. Wow, what a view. Could this possibly be where God parted the Red Sea? And then Miriam sang her song? That's a great view of Wadi Watir. Wow. Wow. That's nice. Really nice. When one thinks of a famous beach landing, I suppose June 6th of 1944 comes to mind. A grave moment in history when very brave men soaked up enemy fire on the beaches of Normandy. But there was also a D-Day in Iwo Jima 4 months earlier. It was the most costly in Marine history. As great as these were, the greatest of all time non-war landing on a beach occurred here on the west coast of Saudi Arabia in 1446 BC. This marked the beginning of a very special boot camp designed to transform a savage group of sinners into saints. These desperate people were like animals released from a cage after being dumbed down by years of slavery and exposure to shocking Egyptian idolatry. They had very limited understanding of who God was and what exactly was his plan to save them along with all of mankind. Even though God loved them with an everlasting love, that love at that time required draconian emergency measures to be implemented upon all that hit the beach that day. Much had to happen in a short amount of time for them to be ready to meet God at Sinai and then to go on to enter the promised land. If not, then as biblical history tells us, all those that grumbled in unbelief over the age of 20 would have to begin an onerous 40-year death march. That's Numbers 14:29. Only Caleb and Joshua passed the test. Moses later failed short. But God graciously buried and then resurrected him to give hope to all of us in the certainty of a future resurrection. For success, God had to get the people to trust him completely. Just as a patient must trust their doctor for optimal healing, so it is then and now that we must trust God in his ability to heal us. This was the only way. And we name this process as the everlasting covenant. Whether one calls it old or new, Abraham experienced it. It's written about in Jeremiah 31:33, Psalms 51, and Hebrews 8. Salvation by faith, not works. Victory comes when the heart and mind knows and loves God, and God's law or his character is internalized. This will naturally cause our outward appearance to change accordingly. Yes, the degenerate, debased masses began to lose their piercings, tattoos, and heavy jewelry after God told them he would not be within their midst after the golden calf incident. That's Exodus 33, verses 1-4. At Sinai, they learned to be well-groomed religious citizens, much like our country was when it was briefly grounded on love for God, family, and country. Don't be fooled. Israel was saved by God in their miraculous exit from Egypt, not by keeping the law. That was a grace response and part of what we call sanctification, getting ready to live in God's presence. This kind of change had to be a new creation, a cleansing of the mind, and the Holy Spirit had to be at work executing the key prophecy found in Genesis 3 verse 15, creating enmity. Enmity was needed between God's people and the serpent. In Egypt, they learned to love serpents. They enjoyed the stories about false gods, sin, and worldly pleasures. David, the psalmist, described this process in Psalm 74. It was much more than just escaping Pharaoh's army. David's talking about a sea monster, a sea beast that has many heads. It's a monster, it's a serpent, it's Leviathan, but almost every translation says heads. We see this same symbology in Revelation 13 and Revelation 12. It's none other than Satan. Thou didst divide the sea by thy strength. Thou breakest the heads of Leviathan. So that day the people were released from the influence of Satan and his lies. For once they didn't have to hear those lies anymore. They were able to be educated in truth from God. They were given an instinctive ability to hate sin in all its forms and thus be ready for the promised land. For God, he set out then to eradicate their love of the world and replace it with a love for God and man. That's the whole 10 Commandments. Love for God, first 4, and then the last 6 are love for men. For fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Abraham loved God and thus obeyed, and that was what we call salvation by faith. The emergency measures there before Sinai required the development of faith via the perturbing imagery of the sanctuary service. And on that beach, they were 32 days away from hearing the eternal law that God was going to speak from Mount Sinai. The law was to show them how to love. It would be a mirror to exhibit and expose their sin. It was a guide to reveal the holiness of Jehovah. It is a great myth that salvation was different before the cross than after. No, it was the same. They simply looked forward in faith to Jesus dying, the same way we look backwards. We also find that the spirit of the age was the same then as now. The spirit now is full of progressive liberalism. We have a world that thinks they can govern without God. Via humanism, atheism, communism, you name it. Israel was God's church, and they seemed more interested in the world's lies rather than sound doctrine from heaven. We see that in many churches today. The miracle of coming out of the Red Sea alive was to activate a faith unto good works that comes from grace. The words of Paul in Ephesians 2 verse 1 to 10 applied then as now. That faith became obedience to God's law through love. Then and now, love for God should not lead to contrived, phony sentimentalism, but real obedience. The outworking of the Holy Spirit began writing the law on their hearts and minds. They were slowly developing a full trust in God. Unfortunately, there was another power at work. The spirit of rebellion. The spirit of disobedience. The word for this in Hebrew is marah. Paul spoke of this in Hebrews 12 verse 15. See to it that none fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. The word for bitterness is also marah. It is the same word used 45 times in the Old Testament. The spring of bitterness, 25 miles from the Red Sea, called Marah, is used only 5 times in the Bible. The two meanings are forever intertwined in history. We have an attitude and a specific geographical place to contemplate this serious sin. Despite a large spectrum of good and evil in the diverse throng, the spirit of rebellion and disobedience can take anyone down. Which brings me to the topic of the mixed multitude. The verse is Exodus 12:38. This is the first text that mentions a mixed multitude joining Israel in the Exodus. This group of people has been further defined as having foreign descent or birth. That is, they didn't genetically descend from the 12 tribes of Israel. Though the largest contingent of this group was Egyptians, that undoubtedly included various peoples that surrounded Egypt, such as Africans, Libyans, and those from northern portions of the eastern Mediterranean. God could have excluded these folks from the 12 tribes, but just as God created Lucifer knowing he would fall, so God included the mixed multitude, knowing they too would fall and not make it to the promised land. They were treated as equals to Israel. Men became circumcised, and they promised to keep the laws of God. Today we have phony division based on race, diversity, equality, and inclusion. In the Exodus, there was perfect diversity. There was perfect equality on what was expected spiritually, physically, and mentally. All were treated equal under the law. There was no special programs or favors. All right, let's look at some more Bible verses that pertain to the mixed multitude. I think you'll find them very interesting because they paint a picture which I believe is similar to the Gentiles of the New Testament. Here's one. Leviticus 24, verses 10 to 16. It speaks about a son born to an Egyptian father and a Hebrew mother who blasphemed the Lord. The verse states that whoever blasphemes the name of God, that is a native Israeli or a sojourner, was to be put to death. Much later in Nehemiah 13:3, we find some foreign descent people to be removed from their assembly. They were identified as coming from the nations that opposed Israel in the past, that is the Ammonites and the Moabites. Verse 22, ye shall have one manner of law, as well for the stranger as for one of your own in your country, for I am the Lord your God. So manner is verdict, and one is judgment. It's mishpat, or there's one custom, one ordinance. I like that. It's consistent, very consistent. Then there's the very famous story in Numbers 11, where it speaks about a subset of people during the Exodus who had an intense craving for meat. The word used for these people was rabble, or mixed multitude, or riffraff. The word rabble, can mean a crowd or a mob. The Hebrew word for rab means large. A closer look at this verse is that it just wasn't the rabble that was complaining, but Israel also was complaining. In fact, the verse says the people of Israel wept for their favorite foods left behind in Egypt. So native or foreigner, both missed their meat. Okay, this next topic is huge in today's society: inheritance. A day doesn't go by where someone is telling me how they were robbed out of theirs due to a greedy sibling. A common event is how a bold son or daughter rapidly runs into the deceased's house to rifle through all the valuables and take all the best stuff before anyone else. Or another common story is how one sibling chooses to live with the parents under the pretense of helping them out. But then with time, they come to believe they own the whole family estate and steal it. Lastly, one sibling works closely within the family business and very cunningly takes over all assets and cuts out the other members. But in Israel, God made sure things were fair. The land then was for the righteous and was equally divided for all that loved God and kept his commandments. The foreigners were grafted into the 12 tribes. In the future New Earth, this same pattern will be similarly performed for the redeemed righteous, and the land will not include just a little small sliver, but will be the whole earth. See Ezekiel 48. Sadly, that land is being fought for today, and it's been fought for over centuries by those that have rejected the lawgiver. So let's take a look what's written in Ezekiel concerning inheritance for the foreigners, the sojourners, the mixed multitude. Ezekiel 47, verse 21. This is how you will divide this land for yourselves among the tribes of Israel. You must allot it as an inheritance among yourselves and for the foreigners who reside among you, who have fathered sons among you. You must treat them as native born among the people of Israel. They will be allotted an inheritance with you among the tribes of Israel. Verse 23, in whatever tribe the foreigner resides, there you will give him his inheritance, declares the sovereign Lord. Wow, it's beautiful. The words sojourner, foreigner, mixed multitude, stranger in the land, they're all very similar and can mean the same thing. What is most fascinating is that David considered himself a sojourner. He said in Psalms 39, verse 12, hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear unto my cry. Hold not thy peace at my tears, for I am a stranger with thee, and a sojourner, as all my fathers were. This concept of being a sojourner is used in the interesting law that a piece of land could never be completely sold. It had to always be available for a relative or redeemer to buy it back. And that would have to occur at the Jubilee year if no one had enough money to get it back. But it stayed within the family. And the reason is because they were sojourners. I find that quite fascinating. And the reason given in Leviticus 25:23 is because God said the land is mine. And he said, for ye are strangers and sojourners with me. So even Jesus, even God, he identified with the people as a foreigner and as a stranger in the land. I find that fascinating. This concept continued on into the New Testament. And this is why anyone that believes that they're saved by blood or genetics sound very foolish. Peter, in Acts 10:34, says he opened his mouth and said, of a truth, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. Hebrews 11:13, strangers and pilgrims on earth. The Old Testament, Isaiah 14, verse 1, for the Lord will have mercy on Jacob and will yet choose Israel and set them in their own land. And the strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. That's New Testament being grafted in. The concept was there in the Old Testament. The concept began with the mixed multitude crossing the Red Sea. Isaiah 56, verse 6 speaks of strangers keeping the Sabbath. There's lots and lots of these anti-Sabbatarian fools now on YouTube spewing their non-biblical theology to take down the fourth commandment and somehow support Sunday keeping. Sad, it really is. Here's one of them now.
Scripture doesn't present the Sabbath as a universal command for all humanity. Between Genesis 2 and Exodus 16, the Sabbath is never mentioned.
This is such a naive statement. I mean, if God gave the Sabbath in all of its glory at creation, and Adam and Eve had a chance to spend each weekly Sabbath with God and talk with him, why would there be a reason to write that down? Enoch, he walked with God for 300 years. That would be many, many Sabbaths. And there would be much joy and much knowledge that he would gain. He could pass it right down to all the patriarchs, through Noah, Shem, on to Abraham. So it was only until Moses in the Exodus that a more formal written statement of what they had learned over the past 2 millennia would make sense. So this idea that there's no mention of the Sabbath during this time is a foolish statement. It really is.
The Sabbath was only given to the Israelites. In all of Scripture, the seventh-day rest was never commanded of any other people.
The nations that surrounded Israel and that were in Israel were punished for their idolatry. They weren't worshiping and loving God, so they obviously weren't keeping the Sabbath. That's why they got destroyed. Okay? We're talking about the moral law here. And there's a big difference between the ordinances and the moral law. It's quite consistent that it was the death penalty if you broke the moral law, but not so for the ordinances.
And it certainly doesn't say that God commanded all of humanity to rest on the seventh day of the week.
This guy's really making me laugh. I don't think he has a clue about the people that were in Canaan that Israel and God had to deal with. I mean, these people were sexually immoral. They were offering their children to Moloch. I mean, look at Leviticus chapter 20, verse 4. It explicitly says there that if someone isn't doing something about the child sacrifice, I mean, God was going to destroy him and his family. So, I mean, come on. The Sabbath was there, but I mean, you don't talk about the Sabbath if people are killing each other and they're sleeping with everything that moves and are offering their children to some god called Moloch.
We don't actually find the concept of a rest on the seventh day of the week, a Shabbat, until Exodus 16.
It's amazing how clueless this guy is to the spirit of this commandment. It's good news. We have a creator God that wants to spend time with us on a special basis for a 24-hour period weekly. He's making it sound like it's drudgery and that it was only for the Jews. Like God didn't create him and he doesn't want to spend that special time. He just wants to say, okay, yeah, I'll just rest in Jesus. The commandment is the only one that starts with remember. It doesn't say thou shalt. So the only way you can keep it is if you love God and you understand what he's trying to do and how he wants to be in your life and sanctify you. Yeah, I don't get it.
The Sabbath is not a moral issue.
The Sabbath is a moral issue because it's intimately linked to our relationship with Jesus as our creator, redeemer, and sustainer. So I think we have to go a little deeper into this. It's not about a day, but who the day is connected to and how we respond to this designated 24-hour palace in time set up by God at creation. The Sabbath predates humanity and will continue to be part of eternity. Consider that the 2 tablets Moses smashed could have been made out of the same sapphire stone as God's throne in heaven. How? Well, look carefully at Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 26. In this verse, we have God's actual throne described as sapphire stone or lapis lazuli. Then in Exodus 24, verse 10, the same stone must have come down from heaven with God because Moses describes sapphire stone pavement here in this specific spot on Mount Sinai when God entertained the 70. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. So it was similar to the sky. Later, Moses went up higher to the summit to get the tablets, where Exodus 31 verse 18 tells us they were inscribed with God's own finger, a signature in stone from his throne.
God's Sabbath commands were only for Israel.
Careful now. Be very careful. That the foreigners that lived within Israel or in the surrounding nations, that they were idolaters, and with idolatry of course, they didn't know God or love God, so they didn't keep His Sabbath. But at the same time, they were severely punished for that. That's why Joshua was given the commission to destroy them. It was for their idolatry. Idolatry is not loving and keeping God's commandments. They were probably keeping other days. So that is not an accurate statement to say that the Sabbath was never part of any other nation or country. Furthermore, there was profound blessings if anyone kept God's commandments, including His Sabbath. It would rain, there'd be crops, they'd have protection from their enemies. And then, of course, when they turned to idolatry and break these commandments, everything would go south. So once again, it's not an accurate statement to say that no one knew or didn't keep the Sabbath because it was only a Jewish, Israeli thing.
The rest that God commands for the Sabbath is so complete that it applied literally to every person and animal in Israel. Here again, we see how the Sabbath was uniquely given to Israel alone. So many of our Torah-keeping friends like to claim that the Sabbath was given to mankind as a whole, as a universal command of rest for everyone. And the Bible just doesn't teach that idea.
Well, enough of that guy. He can give you a headache. So, I want to speak about a very interesting prophecy found in Daniel chapter 11. At verse 40, Daniel speaks about the time of the end. The king of the south will attack the king of the north. That seems to be going on right now. But then you read on, and it says, many will fall, but these will escape. And specifically mentioned is Edom, Moab, and the Ammonite leadership. What does this mean? Well, in studying the mixed multitude, the sojourners and the strangers that left Egypt with Israel, it says none of them made it into the promised land. In other words, they died off during those 40 years. But what's not mentioned is that a lot of people were free to leave the camp of Israel. And because they spent their last few years there in Edom and Moab, up in the mountains near Petra, this is probably where the mixed multitude, the sojourners, the strangers lived and filtered away when they left Israel. So they were believers that in a sense had left the church. We call them backsliders today. And every church has thousands and thousands of them. My church, I think there's probably more people that left that are in it. But I think what this prophecy is saying is that when these people see end time events going down, they're going to remember what they're taught and they're going to come back in. Whereas the people that were never taught, this is verse 42 now, it says he'll extend his power against other lands, like the land of Egypt won't escape. Why? Well, Egypt in prophecy is people that are secular. They're the atheistic people. They don't know the truth, so how are they going to know how to respond? So I think this is very encouraging, and again, lots going to be happening here in the next few years. Stay tuned. Important point to make is that the mixed multitude was treated the same way Israel was. They had to be circumcised and they had to abide by all the laws. And even when they finally got to the promised land, they inherited the land also. In fact, they could choose what of the 12 tribes that they wanted. So it's a misnomer to think that the mixed multitude somehow was worse than Israel. They were pretty bad, and a lot of them had to be put to rest after the golden calf incident, but they represent current day Gentiles. They are grafted in just like any one of us. Galatians 3:29, we're all heirs according to the promise.